Now, most of the world's airlines hedge that price slightly, but an increase to $120 a barrel will be devastating to profits.
So are we going to see profits drop, or are the airlines simply going to pass this extra cost now onto the consumer, the passenger?
Well, that's an interesting question. Prices have been climbing steadily over the past year because the airlines have been very disciplined in capacity, which means they have not been adding seats. They have been filling the seats they have. Load factors, the number of people on planes has steadily risen. I don't believe there is a great deal of room to continue to raise prices. So I think this is going to have a very tough effect on the bottom line for most of the world's air carriers.
Now, we know that at most times the price of oil sometimes has less to do with actual reality, actual supply, and more to do with sentiment and emotion, right, and things like this. Saudi Arabia is offering to make up that difference, the production that is lost from Libya. In the short term, will that have the effect of tamping down prices?
Well, historically, when you look at spikes like this, caused by international events, prices have returned to a more moderate level. And certainly the commitment of the Saudis to up production is a hopeful sign. Now, whether that actually happens or not, we'll have to see.
Peter Goltz, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The head of Tunisia's Islamist Ennahda movement says his group could help form an interim government. Speaking in Turkey, Rashid Ghannouchi said he's ready to take part in elections if the conditions are right. Tunisia's interim government is looking fragile after a spate of recent resignations. Nazanin Mosheri reports from Tunis.
This is where you can feel Tunisia's political mood. These young people have been camping here for weeks. The latest top resignations have made little difference. They don't just want those in power out, they want a complete overhaul of the system.
We want a transitional council because the interim government represents the Ben Ali era, and we want a parliamentary system.
The people say they are not responsible for these violent scenes from the weekend. A group called Takriz, which means anger, has claimed responsibility and is promising more trouble. All of this has left Tunisia's interim government very weak. One party that could play a role is Ennahda, an Islamist movement legalized for the first time in 20 years. Its exiled leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, could be a real political player.
Ennahda is the most structured party and has the largest network of people. But Ennahda, like all the parties here, does not have a political program.
A key date for all involved is March 15th. That's when the caretaker president's term ends. If he stays, it makes Tunisia's constitution null and void. If he goes, then the army will have to step in.
Tunisians have got used to seeing army out on the streets. It's soldiers, not police, who maintain security here. If the political situation isn't resolved in the next few weeks, there is a real possibility this country could be under military rule until the next election is called.
It was the uprising here in Tunisia that inspired people from around the world. But building a democracy in a country which suffered from years of dictatorship is not going to be easy. Nazanin Mosheri, Al Jazeera, Tunis.
Mexican authorities have found a mass grave in the south of the country. For more on that, let's go over to Shihab Ratanzi at our Washington, D.C. news center. Shihab?
Alan, police in the state of Guerrero say the grave contains the bodies of at least 17 people. A spokesman said that the grave was found on Tuesday in the town of San Miguel Totolapan and that more bodies could be discovered. It marks the 5th mass grave found in Mexico since June. Meanwhile, a UN anti-drugs agency has reported that Mexican drug traffickers are displacing Colombian gangs in the production and supply of heroin. The report from the UN's International Narcotics Board also says that the purity of Mexican-produced heroin is increasing. An official for the board says that a great deal of the heroin produced in Mexico ends up in, quote, very select, end quote, US markets. Mexican President Felipe Calderón is due to meet the US President Barack Obama at the White House on Thursday. And against a backdrop of continuing violence in Mexico, relations have been strained over the shared responsibility for tackling the production and supply of drugs both sides of the border. 2 weeks ago, a U.S. immigration official was shot dead and another wounded while on duty in northern Mexico. In the last week, the weapon used was traced to Texas. Another reminder that an effective strategy against the drug gangs may not simply be a matter of Mexican authorities violently cracking down, as Frank Contreras reports.
Neighbors in distress. Once again, security, or the lack of it, will top the agenda when the U.S. and Mexican leaders meet. Nearly 40,000 people have lost their lives in Mexico's drugs war. Two of the most recent casualties, U.S. federal agents who were in Mexico to investigate migrant smuggling groups. 1 week after the shooting, these suspects, allegedly members of the Zetas drug trafficking organization, were arrested. Police say they confessed to committing the killing, calling it a case of mistaken identity. Mexico and the United States are economically intertwined, but the relationship is often delicate. The latest source of tension? Leaked U.S. diplomatic messages that describe Mexican security forces as corrupt and uncoordinated. The criticism has angered President Felipe Calderón. He points out it's U.S. drug users and lax gun laws that fuel the problem.
¿En qué tienen que cooperar los americanos? ¿En reducir el consumo de drogas? No lo han reducido. Está creciendo incluso, ¿no? Está creciendo en varios factores, sobre todo en metanfetaminas.
The latest opinion polls in Mexico show a majority now seriously question Calderón's aggressive security policy. With only 2 years remaining in his presidency, many observers say it's failed.
Calderón's war is really Calderón's war. He thought it up. He decided to get into this on his own. Not only there was no U.S. pressure, there was basically U.S. indifference.
Washington has invested $1 billion over the past 3 years to train and equip Mexican security forces, but the total amount of aid to Mexico has been cut by 30%. The remaining amount is not nearly enough, according to some observers here. And many want U.S. politicians to do more to stem the flow of weapons from north to south by tightening U.S. gun controls.
And then there's the issue of illegal immigration. It will also be on the agenda, but in the current climate, it'll take a back seat to the issues of security, drugs, and violence. Frank Contreras, AlJazeera, Mexico City.
The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in favor of protesters who picket outside military funerals. The Westboro Baptist Church mounts anti-gay demonstrations outside such military funerals. The group claims God is punishing the armed forces for the nation's tolerance towards homosexuality. A man did sue the church after they gathered at his son's funeral in 2006, and he won a $5 million settlement, but that ruling, or rather this ruling, now throws out that judgment. The commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan, David Petraeus, has offered a personal apology for the killing of 9 Afghan boys. The helicopter attack occurred in the Pech Valley of Kunar province as troops searched for those responsible for a rocket attack on a NATO base on Tuesday. American forces are in the process of closing their bases in that valley, despite previous claims that the rugged eastern mountain area was vital to the